things are good when you're happy, right? Yeah, sure.
True.
Hey, welcome to Big Story. I'm Alex Morrissey, and today we have a wonderful guest. Hold on a second. I always forget to do the be quiet button. There you go. Be quiet. Heidi MacDonald has joined me. Heidi, super excited to have you on. I felt a growing bond with you because of your obsession with the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work, and I'm like, oh, I actually am cut from the same magical cloth that allows you not be seen in the woods at night too. So,
Oh boy,
yeah.
Tolkien, amateur Tolkien scholars. Woof.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
well, so much to talk about.
Yeah, it's like it was funny because I pulled out my well tattered. It's got this green tint to it, which I don't know where that came from. Of the Silmarillion, which is like really my favorite of the favorites. And it was so funny because when they announced the series on Amazon, like I think the early scuttlebutt was going to be the Silmarillion. Like this was this kind of like, whoa, wow, what a interesting dive. And then and it's not, so, which is fine. I'm like, oh man, I really wanted to see what they could do with that,
Well, I've been saying forever that I mean, long before Game of Thrones came on, I said, oh, if you really want to do an HBO fantasy, they should get the rights to the Silmarillion, because it would, I mean, you could do it for 20 seasons,
Sure.
literally.
Yeah.
You just have to plan it out a little bit, but you could pretty much do a whole season of every chapter of the book. And it went to Amazon instead. I'm not sure. There's been actually some maneuvering with the rights to the Tolkien estate of late, and for some reason I didn't delve into it. I guess I didn't want to be disappointed, but
Right.
I think that a company just acquired the rights that Saul Zaentz had, which was just the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the appendices. So I think the family was obviously dead set against ever having any adaptations of the Silmarillion or any of the other materials from Unfinished Tales or Tolkien's other works. But all the gatekeepers are dying off or have died off, so we'll
Sure.
see. I think, well, it's a long way before they'll ever be in public domain, so the remaining heirs might want to cash in on some of that. I
Yeah.
would. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I mean, so far I feel like they're doing a great job, sort of like, sort of continuing I guess the visual sensibilities of the world that Peter Jackson sort of initiated with what has become the gold standard for fantasy, in
Right.
modern time. And and with the pure, I mean, it's so funny. It's so funny about Tolkien is that, like, I think people who might be coming to it, later, you know, recently, especially if they're reading the books or watching stuff, they might go like, "Oh, this is so formulaic," or "This is so sort of like this has been done a million times." It's like, well, it wasn't. It was never done a million times. It was never done once. This is
It's
it.
where it comes from.
Yeah, and it's this interesting
Like he
kind of,
invented all this stuff.
yeah, like I'll have conversations like with younger friends of mine. They'd be like, "I don't know, I don't get the Beatles," and I'm like, "Oh man, okay, so we need to have a little conversation here about like how time works and like like we." So yeah, so the Beatles and and JRR Tolkien, there you go. Yeah, it's cool. I really do. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, someone's going to do something with the Silmarillion. Like it's gotta happen.
Well, I think we'll see how this goes. And I mean, there is like this kind of manga version of some of the stuff coming out, the history of the Rohan, I believe.
Okay.
And the thing is that the Tolkien family sign, I believe it's pronounced Tolkien. I always
Yeah.
say Tolkien, but it's Tolkien. And um the Tolkien family did sign one of the all-time worst deals back in the 60s with Saul Zaentz, who was a bit of, a shystery type producer, and they signed this deal that gave them the rights to The Lord of the Rings in perpetuity forever,
Right.
and with no reversion clause. And they didn't know. They didn't know in those times. I mean, in those days, authors were just delighted that their book had been optioned.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you can imagine, again, I'm not sure of what the pittance of money that they offered was, but it wasn't very much. And so they did not, and the family, of course, did not like the things that were done with it, which included the Rankin Bass Hobbit
Yeah.
and the first Ralph Bakshi unfinished Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Then now that's a whole other thing.
I drag
And
my fan. I'm like I'm like the youngest of like sort of half the family, and they're all like 8 to 10, 13 years older than me. Like so they're like they're not kids when I'm a kid, and I drag all of them, including the parents, to go see the Bakshi film when it came out. So like
oh yeah,
this is what they had to do. They like had to. I don't know how I swindled everyone into going to see this one.
I remember I dragged my family to see it too, but I mean, of course, they were going to have to take me to see it.
Right.
And I remember just being like really perplexed by it.
It was confusing. It was
It was.
it was cool. Like there was some really cool stuff, but I felt like I was like I didn't feel immersed into the moment.
Yeah.
I remember that as a
And
kid.
I mean, I've never seen it since. And
Hmm.
so I see Ralph Bakshi on Facebook. He's always posting stills from it and everything,
Right.
and it looks beautiful. I'm like, oh, it
Yeah.
probably actually was kind of cool. Probably should have kind of given it a chance, but it'd be interesting to revisit. I mean, I guess it's not released or able to. I mean, I don't know if I can even watch it. Probably have to do
I'm
some kind of
sure
bootleg.
I'm sure that tied up licensing agreements are probably what is holding the world back from this, piece of history. Um, Yeah, I mean, like, like you were saying, like, I'm sure that the estate was probably like, oh wow, we're gonna get paid, for something that's already been done. This is
$20,000.
right. I mean, like, well, I mean, you wonder how much. I mean, I don't even know like what the Broccolis paid Ian Fleming, and like talk about another in perpetuity thing that has just stuck around. So
Right. I mean, thank God there are royalties. I mean, my understanding is that the rights to Tolkien's work is held by a family trust,
okay,
and which is pretty smart. And obviously, Christopher Tolkien, who lived to be like 96,
yeah,
and he just passed away. I think he passed away just a few years ago.
yeah,
And
I think, yeah,
yeah, of course, they hated. He detested the movies, the Peter Jackson movies, like the whole family tutted about that. Except there's one renegade. His son, Paul Simon, actually
okay,
is the renegade who he's actually listed as a consultant
oh,
on
okay,
this Rings of Power. So I guess he's the one friendly Tolkien who talks to people who make the stuff. And we'll see. I mean, again, as more of the old timers die off, I do think we'll eventually see the rights to the Silmarillion
it feels like
loosened up.
inevitability. It
Yeah,
just feels like it. I don't know.
but the question is,
Yeah,
given what we're seeing of the Rings of Power,
yeah.
should we really look forward to that?
Well, so I mean, very little in the ways of like. I mean, the appendices are they're not even an outline. The appendices are so loose and rich with information. Like they're super
Mhm.
fun. Like they are really like for an eager, avid person who's really into the whole thing. You're like, oh, and this and this and this. But like to develop narrative, it's a little off, And I think that they've had to like do the whole sort of like move this here, and we'll kind of create a through line. And I think it's another one of those sort of like like record producers like, oh well, if we get this band that sounds a lot like this other band that's selling, people will buy this band. And I think that this feels a lot like, well, if we make it seem like the thing that everyone already else likes, they're gonna love it. And I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't think that's actually proven to be an actual thing. That's a
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was on board with the first 2 episodes. Okay, I thought
Yeah.
they were pretty good in setting up the main players. We got Galadriel,
Yeah.
Elrond, Gil-galad. Obviously, we're headed to Numenor, which is going to be the main story of this season. We meet the hobbits. We meet Durin, for
Yeah.
Celebrimbor,
Yeah.
and it's promising. It was very promising, and a lot of mysteries are set up. Now in episode 3, I have to say, are you also watching House of the Dragon?
Yeah, so I have not watched episode 3 of the Rings yet because I was embroiled in a bocce tournament this weekend, so we haven't had the time to sit down and
Well,
watch it.
it's very all-consuming, of
Eh,
course.
yes, very much so. And but today during lunch I did catch the House of Dragons. So
Right.
that one my wife has no interest in. So I'm like, all right, well, I'll watch that while I'm, eating food. Cat, watch out, cat.
Right. Yeah. Chat cat. Yeah.
Um,
So I will say this, and it will become, I feel, very clear in episode 3 of Rings of Power that it is written on a level that is not quite up to code. And House of Dragon is really well written, and the characters are speaking in a way that is archaic and yet evocative. And
mhm.
in Rings of Power, there's some dialogue, especially when you see episode 3, that is, I think when I do my recap, I'm going to call it Numenor 90210. So you'll see, and there's some stuff in there that's, like the Big Bang Theory level of slapsticky, and I'm like,
Okay.
oh, cringe. It was a bit cringe for me, but then there was other parts of it that were like super cool. I do love Galadriel. I do think
Yeah, yeah,
she rocks. Yeah.
she's got that kind of thing that I think, at least for me, I was when they introduced Rey in the recent Star Wars films, I'm like, oh, this actor has so much sort of determination in their portrayal of a character. I'm like, I'm really
Right.
into that. And I like that sort of characterization. So I think that, this version of Galadriel is it has that sort of like gritty, I'm gonna do this, like, sort of decorum be damned, let's go.
Mm, mm,
Yeah, and I think, and both of these shows are off piste, like
mm.
there's no mountain trail for them to go sledding down or skiing down. They're going off in uncharted areas in so many ways.
Well, it's in a lot of ways, and but with House of the Dragon, you do have obviously the Game of Thrones example, which up until the last 3 episodes, I mean, there was some grumbling about the last season, but people loved some of the episodes. Like there was huge excitement up until the dark battle of Winterfell. I think it
Mhm.
was I think it was pretty positive, or at least wasn't as negative as it later turned. But so far, they do seem to be holding their own. With Rings of Power, yeah, they really are sledding down an unknown hill. I wonder, and I don't have the names of the showrunners next to me, and I haven't memorized it, so I'll have to look it up here. But they haven't really done anything. They don't really have a track record.
Yeah.
And apparently Amazon opened it up to kind of a bake, what do they call it, a cook off, and these two fellas, patrick mckay and jd payne, were the winners. Now it seems like they are super Tolkien nerds, which is awesome, but I'm not sure they have never run a show before, let alone a $1 billion show that the hopes and dreams of Amazon are hinged on. So, well, I think this might be kind of like The Witcher, which is another. I
Mm,
mean, it is a bonanza for fantasy fans right now. And The Witcher is another show that started off pretty rocky,
yeah.
just because the person who was running it had never run a show before. And I think it's season 2 of The Witcher. I mean, even I think by the second part of season 1, it had really found its footing a lot more,
Mhm.
and season 2 was pretty solid. So I'm hoping with Rings of Power that they kind of learn as they go a little bit, because I can definitely, with episode 3, I started to see like some storytelling cracks that were not worthy of a show with this imprimatur.
Sure, of that, yeah, that's, I mean, it does carry a bit of a, a legacy, as far as, I mean, well, listen, it's the biggest book series ever, and people,
Oh, it's the most beloved. It's the
yeah,
most beloved. I believe it was voted the most beloved book of the 20th century or the
yeah,
last 100 years or something. I mean, it is immensely, immensely powerful
yeah,
and popular. And I mean, the fact that, I mean, even like, just if you have the 5 core books of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, which is, um, 2,000, 1,500 to 2,000 pages of stuff, and it still has so much. I mean, the fact that you and I are amateur scholars. I mean,
yeah,
there's people could speak Elvish. There are literal Tolkien scholars. There are books, scholarly books written about it all the time.
yeah,
There are journals, devoted to its language. I mean, this invented world. This one man created such an invented world of so much depth that it's really astounding. It's absolutely astounding. And
yeah. I think one of the beautiful, excuse me, one of the beautiful parts for me is that while he put so much effort into creating the worlds, the languages, all this history, when you read the books leave so much space that it affords you, the reader, all this area to ask questions and
mhm,
fill in the colors and the blanks in the all the textures. And that's a really one that's, to me, that's beautiful. So when I read more modern, fantasy, where it's highly descriptive of, this, that, and the other thing, and everything is down to the, the whatever buckles on the whatchamacallits, and I go,
yeah.
I'm like, I don't need that. Like, I really want to hear. I want a little more latitude as a reader to kind of get into the world on my own, on my own accord. How did you discover the books? Like, I know exactly the moment in time, and it was a very
Mm.
unexpected thing.
Well, yeah, we should definitely swap stories. So my uncle was the first one to have read them, and he went off to the army and left. He was drafted and went off to the army and left his books behind. And I saw them, and these were old. I mean, I am old, so these were the original weird covers. Barbara, forget her last name, but they were or Gervasio Gallardo. They were very strange covers that didn't reflect the inside of the books at all.
Yeah.
And I guess my uncle Peter had loved them, and so I lived with my grandparents at the time, and my grandfather said he would read it aloud, and I hadn't read The Hobbit. I was only like 9 years old at the time, and I
Right.
hadn't read The Hobbit, so we went straight to The Lord of the Rings, and my grandfather started reading it aloud, and of course, a chapter a night, so it was a very long reading session. And I mean, it was magical.
Yeah.
I was done. And then he kind of petered out towards the Two Towers. So I had to read the rest of. I read the Return of the King in the book form. He didn't read it aloud. And then I came to the appendices, and I was just like, I mean, I can't even think of this moment. And of course, there was a bit of Tolkien mania around this time. So there was the calendars, the
Uh-huh.
Hildebrandt brother calendars. So of course I was really into those. There was a slim shelf of Tolkien books, and I immediately was really into them. And I don't know, I was just obsessed. I immediately became obsessed with it, and I immediately became obsessed with other fantasies. So I immediately was into Narnia and
Right.
Prydain and other Arthurian. There was a lot of Arthurian fantasies at that time, and then came the cheap imitations like the Sword of Shannara books, which of course I read.
Sure.
I was
Same
like,
here.
yeah, and I was
But
like,
they were like sort of
not
like,
as good. It's got that cool Hildebrandt Brothers cover, but it's not quite
yeah,
the same, you
yeah.
know.
Yeah. Well, it was far more like, so yeah, for me, like, so I my father was not a reader of this genre, but he had the three books in a slipcase, and they all looked like, it looked like a stained glass. That's what it
Mm,
looked like. It was like the
right.
art looked like stained glass. And it just sat in this room, like upstairs, we had this big upstairs, like sort of like family room, which had like a porch all around it on the second floor. And it just sat on a table in there. And I just kept kind of like, what is that? What is that? What is that? And this has got to be like 76-ish. And so I walked over, eventually slid a book out, and kind of look at and oh, well, there's like kind of like, there's a map. Well, what's this? And like, so like the map was like, that was sort of like my entry into what this is a different world. And like, and for me, getting to the appendices was like the equivalent of, I guess, like, the Easter egg or the additional bonus DVD.
Bonus content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, like there's more to this. And then it was maybe like 3 or 4 years later when The Hobbit came into the picture, because that was like an assigned reading, I think, like in seventh or eighth grade. So it was one of those kind of like, oh, I know this world kind of thing. So, and then so hence all the stuff. And yeah, and like this, it sort of dovetailed in with Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of came into play in the late 70s for me. So it was all this kind of everything was all kind of there, post Star Wars. So it all kind of like hit at a moment, the Micronauts and all those kind of cool.
Right. They're all the world building. I mean, really, it comes down to world building.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Tolkien was an incredible world builder, never been surpassed, obviously. Unsurpassed world builder. And, it must have frustrated him a bit that C.S. Lewis, his buddy, just came and kind of essentially ripped him off and like just whipped out these 7 books and, could write so easily and so fluidly. And, Tolkien never finished anything after The Lord of the Rings. I mean, that was longer than like a short story.
Yeah.
And he just dithered endlessly. And, his son had to put together the Silmarillion. I mean, it's really just one of the greatest examples of procrastination and world culture history. But, he wasn't a writer. He actually wasn't a writer. He was a world builder. That was his thing that he did. He invented languages. He came up with stories, and he managed to write these few things down, but he never had the wherewithal to write a sustained narrative after that. And he started many. I mean, he really was one of these writers who would start things and then not finish them. And some of the things that he started are just heartbreaking that he didn't go any farther with them, because they're just, he was a very good writer. He was a really good tale spinner, and I guess he kind of thought himself a poet, and the poems and songs that are rife throughout the books are, they're, what's the word? Not doggerel. There's another word for kind of middle brow poetry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That I can't think of. But for all of that, the whole book is basically written like a poem. I mean, it's written in such beautiful language, and every word of it. I mean, I had, my whole thing was that after, I think I did find the map. I think finding the map was one of just a pile of papers that was probably what piqued my interest in it. And then I read the books. I don't remember. I very vividly remember in my life my grandfather reading them to me, but I don't remember subsequently reading the books. But I do know that I must have read them and several times, and that I had a real photographic memory. So we would actually play a game where somebody would read a passage from the book, and I would tell them what chapter it was. I mean, I was right. I would say 9 out of 10. I mean, it was hard to stump me. And I was always trying to get people to do it because it was, so much fun, and they just got bored doing it because I was right all the time. So, so I pretty much did memorize the books, and which is why I quote them so much on Twitter and on the beat and everywhere. It's, I have like all these little passages that other people might not quote at all that are just buried in my memory. So you discovered the map, and then what happened?
So then I just started, I wasn't a huge reader as a kid, but I kept coming back to the books, and I would read from them, and I just kept reading from them. And by the time The Hobbit became a sort of assigned project for school, I had to read that, and I read it, and I'm like, oh, I know this stuff, thinking I knew it. So I read it, and then I was like, oh, this is great. So then I was able to go back and really sit down and go through the books, and
Mm.
they really became like super, 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 just like bedrock for me when it came to my framing of so much when it comes to story. The
Mhm.
idea for me, a story, and like, and there are those bedrock things. Like, listen, for science fiction, Star Trek is kind of a bedrock element for me. Like, there's this sort of utopian, uh, team aspect to traveling in space, and and doing
Mhm.
things
Yeah.
with meaning behind it. And
Oh, it's idealistic. It's very
yeah,
idealistic.
absolutely. And so, like, and but the sort of the quest aspect that the Lord of the Rings represented, um, that's very much like in Star Wars. I mean, you have this sort of thing like where here's the quest, and just like King Arthur, like all these things, like there's this
Mm.
real strong sort of motivational aspect of like, you have been charged to do this, now do it. you
But
know
but the thing that Star Wars, and I'm sure George Lucas was, familiar with Lord of the Rings, and I mean he's probably somewhere talked about it a little bit. And the thing that he did with the first Star Wars movie was, uh, and there had been science fiction movies before,
Mhm.
and there had been some very good ones, but they were like 2001: A Space Odyssey. They were very cerebral and remote. Whereas with Star Wars, very much like the opening of The Lord of the Rings, he did give you this idea of this richness, between the Sand People, the Jawas,
Yeah.
and Mos Eisley, and the smugglers and the Huts. I mean, it really was this world building that gave you this richness of this milieu, that there was so much else going on. There was so much else, and Star Trek had the same thing. I mean, with the Andorrans, the Vulcans, and the
Mhm.
this and the that, and the Romulans, and the you know Ponfar, and I think they didn't do it quite as I think it was a lot more slapdash when they did it with Star Trek, and then obviously when they came
Sure.
back with it, they doubled down on all the world building and the myth making of it. But I do think it's that level of it fires your imagination,
Mhm.
as I always say.
Yeah, and I
And
think someone like Lucas, who I think is a person who's driven by their creative impulses, in the idea of like, what excited me. Like, I have this theory about the 12-year, what I call the 12-year-old theory. Like, the thing that is inside you that sort of like locks into you for the rest of your life is what really,
mm,
at
yeah,
12 years old, that's it. You're set. And I think that's where he sort of kind of derived so much of his things. Like, what did I love? What I loved,
mm,
those cliffhangers at the end of the serial films. Okay, I'll make Indiana Jones, and like, the world loves Indiana Jones. Like, I think you have this kind of thing, if you can just listen to the things that made you happy, and then generate things that make you happy as you're generating it, that love carries on. People go, oh, I can identify with that sense of joy.
right. Well, George Lucas is a very interesting example because obviously he hit it big with Star Wars,
Yeah.
and then he hit it big with Indiana Jones, which was another love of his, like the 12-year-old love of his. And he's his big failure, aside from Howard the Duck, which he produced, was
Hey, man.
was The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones. Do you remember that?
Of course I remember that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I like to call that the first well, the first great betrayal was the Ewoks, but Young Indiana Jones was the second great betrayal because it was so damn boring.
Right.
I mean, that show was so uninvolving and so boring. Like, I never even finished it. I didn't even watch the whole series,
Oh, no,
you know?
I might have been a little old for it when it came. When did it come out? Do you remember?
I guess it came out in the late 80s, maybe early
Yeah.
90s.
So I think yeah, I was already off in college when that came out, so I don't think I really had the sort of the interest. I mean, as much as I loved Indiana Jones, I don't think I was like, I want to watch. I mean, I wanted to watch Moonlighting. You know what I mean? Like I had moved on to something that was a little more sort of character driven.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're retconning it there, Alex. I think if it had been more exciting, you would remember it better. You
Oh no,
know, I think it was just such a bad TV show that you're like, "Ugh, I'll go watch Moonlighting." I mean,
yeah,
I mean, it was just so weird. And then every once in a while, if you're searching somebody on IMDb, you'll see that they have young Indiana Jones in their credits, and it's just like, wow. I mean, this show is like, even the Ewok Adventures are remembered more than that show, because it was so surplus to,
he called it like what was it? Edutainment. I think that was like that's where they coined that term edutainment
yes.
for the show. And I mean, having spent enough time in corporate America, I really wonder if there was some sort of aspect of there might have been funding that was coming to pay for this thing, like there was something that could have been tied into it, hence its longevity, so ABC, I think, was the network behind that show, which had a very strong educational sort of, I don't know, production.
So wait, I have to look this up and see when it came out, because this is very interesting, because there's one other thing that we need to bring up. The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, 1992.
Oh
Okay.
wow.
So
I was out of college.
yeah. So I was fully grown as well, but still. Now,
And there was no Moonlighting anymore.
Yeah. So just 4 years before that, George Lucas had made Willow.
Yeah.
And which was his attempt to do the Star Wars. And this movie was considered a flop. But if you, like, my family is really into fantasy.
Yeah.
And they love Willow.
It's a home run in our house.
It is a home run, right? And for the people who loved it, it was a home run. And I have to say, Val Kilmer as Mad Mardigan, I mean, that is one of the most incendiary adventure characters ever put on screen.
Yeah,
and they're just like, yeah, he is the equal of Han Solo in Indiana Jones.
Han Solo, he's the anti-hero. He's great. And he puts out so much like dynamic, sort of actions throughout this whole film, through acting, through his physicality, which listen, I will die on the hill of Val Kilmer as one of the great talents in cinema. And it's funny, like my wife and her friend ended up watching Real Genius not too long ago, and they were like, "Oh, let's watch that." I'm like, "You guys are going to love it." And they're like, "What?" And they couldn't have loved it anymore because he's amazing in it. He just was such a fire.
Yeah, he was on fire. And listen, Joanne Willie, later Joanne Willie Kilmer, I wonder why. She's great. Warwick Davis is great in it. I mean, it really is. When I say great film, it's not a great film, but it's just a great entertainment. Yeah. And I mean, he hooked up with Ron Howard, who was just the right person to make that movie. And so, George Lucas, he had it in him. He always had it in him. And it just, and it's inarguable that the prequels are way better than the sequels. I mean, they should have just gone. I hope someday Disney's got to just leak his plans for what he was going to do with the last 3 Star Wars films, because they couldn't have been worse than what they ended up doing. Because, which I just, let's let 3 completely different directors tell one story. No, it's not Exquisite Corpse. This is, they just completely effed it up. And so, what can go wrong? And I don't know how we got off on this whole tangent.
Yeah, well, I mean,
genres, franchises.
They're all tied into Tolkien. That's the thing.
Well, that's true. I mean, Tolkien was first, and he absolutely influenced all of these. And I mean, there's a book. This author called Lynn Carter read a book called, Behind the Lord of the Rings. Did you read that?
I did not read that one.
Oh, okay. I memorized. This is another book I memorized. I hope I have it somewhere. No, it might have burned up in the fire. I have to replace all these books somehow. this book was about the history of fantasy, and of which there's a lot in literature, but there really never had been anything quite like The Lord of the Rings. There
Yeah.
never had been something that was quite, I mean, there had been a lot of quests. Obviously, quests are, the backbone of storytelling. But there hadn't been anything that just had that level of, I guess, again, world building, and just the idea that there was elves and dwarves and
Mhm.
little people. It was just that men, elves, dwarves, and little people. And
Yeah.
then talking trees. He didn't have giants in the
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, but a lot of books have giants instead of
Yeah.
one or the other. But I was just something about that. And so yeah. So so what happened when you tried to read The Sword of Shannara?
Um, I was really just kind of bored with it. I mean, I kept just like I don't know what I wanted. I wanted something more out of the tale. It So that book came out right about the time I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I think I was trying to make it in my head like a Dungeons and Dragons experience.
Mm,
And so I might have just been conflating my experience of being the adventurer versus reading the adventurer. And it felt very sort of schoolyard in comparison. Like I didn't feel like I was reading up. Like Lord of the Rings always felt like I was reading up when I was a kid. Like I'm
mm,
like, oh, I'm reading something here that's for grown-ups or something. Like
right,
this is there's a lot of information in here which is sort of beyond my understanding as a kid. So I'm like, this is exciting. And I still read it and I go, this is exciting, and I still don't understand it. I'm kidding.
right,
Um,
right. Ah, but
but
I mean, I think the thing was just like, I mean, it's like if you go to a restaurant and a great chef cooks you a meal and
uh,
makes the greatest, I mean, sushi of all times. And then you're like, well, I liked the salmon sushi, so I guess I'll cook up some salmon. And the salmon is good when it's cooked up, but it's not as good as the sushi, right?
right.
Or the ahi tuna. A tuna salad sandwich is not the same as ahi tuna.
No,
So
but you haven't
bluefin
had
tuna.
mine. I make a pretty darn good tuna salad.
Oh well, listen, I've had great tuna salad. Don't get me wrong. Here in New York, we have some awesome tuna salad. But I guess Terry Brooks. I mean, he's a fine writer,
Yeah.
but he just didn't have the world building. I mean, again, let's just try to they did make the movie about Tolkien, his life, which he led a pretty. I mean, it's right for a movie. It had some good melodrama and war and
Right.
all this stuff. So it really was. The movie was a bit dull to my mind, but um, he, Tolkien, was a super genius. I mean, an absolute super genius who, again, invented something like 12 different languages.
Right.
And that's what he did for fun, was invent languages. And if you read some of like if you go on which I've done in the past, when I first read Tolkien, there was no such thing as Wikipedia, but now there is. And if you go to Wikipedia and you look at the page for Sindarin, which is one
Mhm.
of the two Elvish languages that he invented, like this is longer than the page for the War of the Roses. I
Right.
mean, like actual historical things that happened. And I didn't even realize that there's been so much research because he left piles and piles of
Tons.
papers.
There are, I mean, I
Yeah.
discovered, back in the early 2000s, the multiple, websites out there that are devoted to Quenya or Sindarin. I mean,
Mhm.
you just, in their
Yeah.
treasure troves for,
Yeah. Oh, I haven't. See,
treasure.
I've never gone onto those, but I have all the home books, I have
Yeah.
all the books,
Yeah.
and I've never ventured on the web. But I mean, it's just like, not only did he, you might be able to give some detail on this that I can't but not only did he invent a language, he invented dialects and regional influences of language. This was I mean, he was, the guy wrote the dictionary, literally wrote, he worked on the Oxford Dictionary. And
Yeah.
he understood, how words develop and how they change culture and how they come, what they mean for societies and everything. And what migration and just to segue, I mean, all this, I mean, we could go on. I really don't think it's worth too much time to talk about, but all this racist outcry about the Lord of the, from racists, and it's just pure racism because there's so many things about the show that isn't in the books, but they just harp on this one thing. So why is that? And it's just, oh, you're being political by women and people of color existing. I just, I've been arguing with some of the trolls on Twitter because it's just so much fun because, like they just can't, I have a pretty good knowledge of this and I have quotes and sources to back me up, and they're just racist. But Tolkien was keenly aware of how populations migrate. He wrote all about it. That's what the appendices are all about. Oh, the people of Eorl came from here, and then they settled in the Anduin, and then they got driven out by bandits, and he completely understood how people migrate and how people how
Well, I mean,
intermix.
There's multiple elves in the Lord of the Rings. There's not just one kind of elf, because thousands and thousands of years, happen, and they're separated. Hey, we don't want to go back to the Undying Lands. We want to stay here. Oh, okay, well, we'll see you guys later. And then they have to leave the Undying Lands and come back. Well, the people they left thousands of years ago, they're different. Time has moved on for them, and it's like those islands, man. Like you have giant tortoises because nobody came along and ate this small version of the tortoise, so they just kept growing.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I feel like the show would have been more true to Tolkien's actual writings about it if all the men of the Southlands had brown skin.
Right. Well, yeah.
It actually would be more accurate to what his intentions were, and were, the Harfoot. I mean, they said they had browner skin. It's right there. What do you what do you need? They should have. You could have them all be brown skin, and it would actually be more accurate. But I mean, Tolkien was as racist as all the men of his generation, unfortunately. I mean, he was no saint where this is concerned, but his intentions, he's on the record as hating racialism, which is what he called it, which was like, Nazi ideas and ideas of apartheid. He was very much against the idea that one race was superior to another. That's really clear in his writings, even though he was obsessed with very blonde elves.
Well, why wouldn't you be, right? One thing that I say over and over again is like, we are all future cavemen. It's just the nature of it. And as high-minded as we think we may be at this moment in time, 50 years from now, people are going to look back and go, wait, why did they do that? And that's just the nature of things. Like, everything kind of moves along. Mores change, language changes, everything changes, and we have to.
And sometimes it goes backwards too. It does go backwards. We go into dark ages.
Changes.
Progress is not all. The future is not all progress.
Progress is never easy, and change is hard. So these are, and it doesn't, and change doesn't always mean progress. So we have to kind of consider all that stuff. So so you don't always just sit around musing about Tolkien, as neither do I. But you do a lot. But you're really engaged in the comic book world, and that was my old business as a penciler and a writer back in the 90s. So I have a very long love for the industry, and comics were my first love when it came to media. How did you get into it? Because I mean, you've kind of been into it for a while, and not only as a professional on the editing side, on the publishing side, but you on your own writing about it. So What like
Well,
where did you love for it start?
my love started just, my whole theory, and there is actually a academic word for this theory, but I don't remember what it is. But it's kind of a theory that's being developed more and more fandoms become mainstream. But just, it's not the material that makes the fans. It's the fans who find the material, you
Mm,
know?
yeah.
And so by whatever genetic makeup I had, I was just a nerd from birth, and uh, just really into, obviously Tolkien was my first great love. That was the first nerdy. That was the first book that I remember. That wasn't, well. I read a lot of kids' books. I loved Oz. I might have read Oz before that, but I loved fantasy. I was really into fantasy, and I was I was really into this world building. I was into things because of my love of Tolkien. I was really into things that were really complicated and had this, lore that you could study. But I was always into comics as well. I'm old enough that I grew up when the kids' comics were by Carl Barks and John Stanley, Little Lulu. I mean, these are just like some of the greatest comics of all
Sure.
time, and perfect reading. My family was very pro comic. They were pro reading. They were pro art. My mother was a cartoonist. She's a fine artist to this day. She just makes art all day. That's just what she does. So I was surrounded by artists. My uncle, whose Lord of the Rings books I had inherited, was also an artist. He painted, and so I was surrounded by a lot of artistic intentions around me. And I do remember exactly how this happened. Was that there was a magazine in the house that my grandmother had that was some kind of teacher's magazine, because I was homeschooled. So my grandmother was my teacher. So she subscribed, is actually, it's a whole other podcast, but um, she subscribed to this magazine for teachers. And of course I was reading it because I just read, I read Modern Maturity, whatever came, I was such a reader. I'd read anything that came in the house. And we didn't have the internet, so I just read all day. And there was an interview with Stan Lee, and it was him trying to, talking about how comics were actually educational, how Marvel comics were taught at universities. And, look, Stan Lee, this is something I was actually talking with a friend about, a friend who was in the comics industry back in the 90s. And that, Stan Lee was very famous in the 60s and 70s,
In
you
70s, yeah.
know. And he's probably less famous in the 80s, but then he had the big comeback and became
Mhm.
incredibly famous. But he was quite well known. You could find, he was on TV, he was on talk shows, he was,
Yeah.
in magazines, he was always being interviewed, and he was a shameless self-promoter. So, I mean, he was
Great.
really good at it.
Yeah.
So this article was just talking about the Marvel comics and saying that they were, educational. And, on that fateful day, there were it was ShopRite, and ShopRite did have the racks of comics in it, horribly riffled through, mutilated. And I did just said, hey, can you buy these comics for
Okay.
me? And it was Marvel. I did get the Marvel comics. There was an issue of Fantastic Four and an issue of Spider-Man. And what got me was that they had footnotes, right?
Ah, okay, sure.
Footnotes.
Editorial
There was
notes.
the editorial that they don't do anymore, because God forbid that somebody explains something you don't know.
Yep.
But they were very, very, very beginner friendly,
Sure.
and they had the recap
Yep.
panel. They had the recap paragraph in every issue that said, born of the atom, it's spurned by humankind. The X-Men are gathered, and
Right.
so it gave you enough to go on. And the footnotes immediately suggested that there was this whole rich tapestry of stories that I had to get up to speed on. And I mean, that was it. I was hooked. I was hooked by those. They were also very, I think the first Fantastic Four issue I read by good fortune was, I think it might be 176. That was where the Impossible Man comes back and
Okay.
goes to the Marvel bullpen. So not only, luckily it
Yeah.
had this really cool book. I think it was George Perez might have even drawn it. That had this another level of the real people in it. It had all these like multiverse versal elements to it. So it
Right.
just had, I just happened to come in at this right time that it really hooked me with um how much depth and what a universe this was. Because I'll tell you, of course I went back and I got some DC comics and
Hmm.
I hated them. I Legion of Superheroes. I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
Bored as hell. Bored to shit. And then the Justice League at that time was infamous. Was it Dick McLaughlin? I forget the name of the artist who was drawing it in the 70s, but he was just so boring. I mean, it's just he's known as one of the most boring. It was so bad. I mean, I'd say he's a bad artist. It was just not interesting to me at that time. And I never got into DC. I picked up one issue of all of them and was immediately bored. I picked up, I've told this story many times also, but I picked up an issue of the JSA that was drawn by Wally Wood, and it had Power Girl with these gigantic, breasts, and I was really offended by it. I was just like, oh, this is not for me. It's
Yeah.
very clearly, and I mean, not like, oh, me saying this is not for me. I'm like, this is not meant for me. I
Right.
am not allowed. Like,
Right.
this is
Right.
not something that they want me to read. The people who made this comic book don't want me to read it. It's not meant for me. So I was horribly unattracted to all that DC stuff. And at the same time, I picked up like issue 102 of the X-Men. That I will never forget. Chris
Yeah.
Claremont, Dave Cockrum, and just all these amazing characters, Storm and Jean and Nightcrawler. I mean, it was just and immediately, and that was like the second half of a story. I think
Right.
I think it was the second half, so it came right in the middle of the story, and didn't matter. I was
No,
immediately
well,
completely.
it's like the James Bond opening. I mean, like you're already in the middle of the action and you get to see the thing come to a conclusion. So, and it's only incentive to say like, well, let me go grab the issue before the two issues before because this is really good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. You know
I
what I mean? You can't just I want to just do, you can't rewrite whatever is your first time, but I would love to know what are the things. Well, I kind of have some idea of what are the things that, but I mean, it was also a time period where there was all these really crazy comics like Howard the Duck and the Defenders. That was my other favorite.
Yeah,
And,
sure.
Steve Gerber was one of the top writers. So there was just, Master of Kung Fu and Killraven and,
Mhm.
you know, Black Panther,
Yeah.
Jungle Action, all this really great, rich stuff that stood the test of time to some degree. So anyway, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Well, no,
What
it's
were you
no,
gonna say?
it's no. When you say that, it's interesting because, like, I mean, the '70s comics certainly on the Marvel side had a very grindhouse kind of vibe to them. Like they were just
Hmm.
kind of like trying some really like, hey, like Bruce Lee's really popular, so let's come up with a character like that. And they did that, but that didn't really solidify him as an interesting character. But then they made him a spy, and then they sent him on
Hmm.
like he started doing things, and now it's like, oh, okay, he's like tied into doing stuff and you know, Ghost Rider or Hellraiser, like they all or Hellblazer. They had all these interesting characters who were just kind of like doing all these interesting things at the time, which, you know, they're of the time, but like but now they're like a rich sort of like, bed for all this new
Hmm.
fertility to be kind of grown.
Right. Yeah. I mean, of course, Master of Kung Fu obviously was really, really racist. And
Well,
at
I'm not gonna say it's racist. I'm gonna say it was indifferent to understanding, and it's
it
in
was of the times. It was
yeah, it was
of
at the
the
time. So
times.
there's no intention of
Yeah.
racism. It was
Yeah.
just like naive to say, okay, well, hey, we're gonna do this, and that's what it
Yeah.
was. You know,
Yes. And I'm really glad that it's been redeemed. And some of the really good parts of it have have kind of stuck around in the
of course.
modern version of it, and it's become something that Chinese American people can watch and really enjoy. So
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful that it's been redeemed that way. But back in the day, I mean, Paul Gulacy's artwork, that's what got me into it. I mean, he
Oh,
was just such a great
no
storyteller, and
doubt.
all the bizarre characters. I mean, there was so much into it that
Yeah.
that you know just had me hooked.
I
So
mean, Mike Zeck sort of made his name doing that book with Gene Day, and it was just
yeah,
it was amazing. So it was a very cool time. Sure, when you're 10 or 11 years old, maybe you're not catching all the things that are wrong with
right.
it. But I don't think the people who were making it were catching the things that were wrong with it at the time. And if
No,
they could, they wouldn't have done it. They would
no.
like, well, wait a minute, let's solve this a little bit in a better fashion.
Yeah. Well, again, times change quite a
Mhm.
bit, and I mean, it's amazing that we have this insane backlash now, and it's always they have all these reasons, but for not liking colorblind casting or things that are even more, that are canon.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I
It's
do you know
there's this entire again, I hate to talk about that, but just it just astounds me. Like this whole, comics are dying crowd can't stand the She-Hulk TV show because there's a scene where they twerk. And it's like, did you read the original comics?
that,
It
that
was
oh,
full of campy,
it was so campy.
um
I mean,
it was so campy.
it was a blast. It was a blast for all those
Mhm.
reasons, and it it survived because of those reasons.
Yeah. And I mean,
If it was just
they
a
say
Hulk, hmm,
comics are so political now. I mean,
well,
Howard the Duck ran for president.
right,
Okay.
yeah,
I mean, I mean, you can't even use some of the things that Marvel did in the 70s, but I
right.
mean, Roxxon, what do you think Roxxon and AIM are? Jesus Christ. Anyway.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I mean, like I said, change is hard, and people have a hard
Mm,
time with it. It's really strange when you're talking about colorblind casting. The first, what I think is for me was really an effective way of doing it. Of course, unfortunately, the reference now is not a openly welcome reference, but when on Louis C.K.'s show, he just cast the best actor for the character from season to season. And if the same person wasn't available, he just hired a new person. So his wife is black. Okay.
yeah.
But his kids weren't. And the kids were different. Like it didn't matter to him because he's like, listen, it doesn't matter. What matters is the story I'm telling gets done by the best people doing it. And I'm like, yes,
Mm,
let's just look at the world in that fashion. I don't care. I really don't care. I just want a good thing being told to me, whether it's a visual thing or on paper. Just tell me a good thing. I like that.
mm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
what did you so like? I mean, so for me, like, reading comics in the 70s, set that template, locked it in at 12, and one of my sisters, to this day will recount the story of like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I'm like, I want to draw comic books, like there's some sort of like, I want to be a magician. I mean, it's a ridiculous
Mhm.
thing to say. Um, did they have this sort of like longevity impact on you, like saying, oh, I want to be involved with comic books? Or did you just say that this is an entertainment form that I dig along with reading and books and in movies or whatever?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was all I ever wanted
Well,
to
if you
be.
read so much,
And
yes.
yeah, obviously. And I was writing stories when I was, 8, 9, 10. I mean, I learned how to type. I would type out my little stories. And I just came about really by accident. Like there was all these great fanzines. So after you read the comics, there was these ads in them
Hmm.
for the comic conventions. And
Yeah.
so I went to the comic conventions. That's how I got. And then I went to and then also the ads for the buyer's guide. And so I
Yeah.
went to the shows back in New York and
The creation
now
shows at
the creation shows.
the Roosevelt
Yeah.
Hotel.
The Roosevelt Hotel now, long
Yep.
gone.
Yep.
I guess it was the Penn Plaza. Now it's, they're tearing it down, which really, tear out a little bit of my heart as well.
Yeah.
And but then I picked up the other fanzines, like the Comics Journal, and there were other fanzines like like I mean, it's not even the road not taken. I mean, I tried that road and I just didn't want to go down it because I did pick up like Comics Reader and Rock RBCC. I mean, there was a very robust slate of print comics fanzines back then, and the ones that I liked was the Comics Journal. That was the one that just again spoke to me, and I just wrote a review of Chris Claremont comic Murata the She Wolf, and I just sent it in I typed it up and I sent it in, and I'm like, okay, they say they want contributions, and they accepted it. There was the editor at the time was a guy named Dwight Decker, so he pulled it out of the slush pile and ran it, and that was my first published work. I'd never submitted anything anywhere. I was like a kid. I was still a kid.
Yeah.
I think I was 19, and then I wrote more. I just kept writing, and
Yeah.
I mean, there wasn't very many girls who were doing it, so it was pretty easy to stand out. I always say that. And then the Buyer's Guide, they invited me to write for them. I wrote for Amazing Heroes. And the Amazing Heroes was this kind of companion fanzine that was really the precursor to Wizard, and it did cover like superhero stuff. But it was the precursor to everything, because they twice a year they would do something called the Amazing Heroes Preview Special, where they would just call up everybody who made comics and say, "What are you doing for the next 6 months?"
Right.
Like, this idea is so unbelievable now that you did this. And of course, I picked all the ones that I loved. So I would call up Will Eisner and Howard Chaykin and the Hernandez brothers. And, Jesus, who else did I mean, it's ridiculous who I talked to, and just blab. And, Dave Sim. I mean, sometimes we'd end up blabbing for hours, and I got to know everybody. I guess everybody got to know me. And I was educating myself and learning but self-education. I was completely self-taught in all of this. I never went to school. I never went to college. And I moved to Los Angeles. I had been living in New Jersey and Maine, and then I moved to Los Angeles. And then I became much more involved in the actual physical scene, of meeting human beings and talking to them, and hanging out at the comic shop. Although there was a comic store in Somerville, New Jersey, where I grew up. It has actually one of the oldest comic shops.
Wow.
It's called Quality Comics. And so I had that, and one of their co-owners was this woman who wrote for the Comics Journal. So it really was this and I never met her. That's the funny thing. I lived in this town, grew up in this town. I never met the woman who owned the comic shop. So, so I again, there was a lot of pieces that fell into place. But when I moved into LA, I started hanging out at the Golden Apple, which is another very legendary comic shop. It's owned by Bill Leibowitz, and very influential. I mean, he was really one of the first comics retailers who kind of had a vision of the comic shop as a pop culture store. So, so we really grokked that. And then he, I think he just took a shine to me. I think a lot of people took a shine to me because I was, pretty young still, and pretty fiery about my comics opinions, and pretty determined to have my say, and as you had to be, and I wasn't intimidated at all by the really overt sexism. I guess I just didn't know any better. I think I just didn't know any better. I didn't know that I was supposed to be afraid of this stuff, or intimidated, or feel
annoyed or upset, or whatever the thing that.
Well, I did get annoyed and upset because it bothered me when people said stupid shit, but I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't intimidated by it. I just never, or I never felt that I didn't belong. I went to one comic shop when I lived in Maine. There was only 2 comic shops there, and I went to one of them, and I had that classic experience of not feeling welcome. And like the guys, it was a real dungeon, and the people who were there didn't even look up or say anything to me. I think they were playing D&D, which I also played, but they just were really rude to me, and I was like, I'm never going back there. And then there was a comic shop in Portland, which is the same spot as now Casablanca Comics, which is a great comic shop. And they were friendly to me, but I was super lucky that I went to Quality Comics and then the Golden Apple, and I was like family. I was like family to the Leibowitzes. I mean, they were my second family. Sharon and Bill and their kids, Ryan and Damon. I'm still doing stuff with them, and and then Bill gave me these insane opportunities. It was like, oh, we have Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz coming in to talk about Elektra Assassin. Heidi, do you want to interview them? And I'm like, okay. and there's, this photo that I don't know if this is my photo. I think it might be my photo that I took, and I don't know where it came from. There was this photo of me and, um, Frank and Bill, and there's also Michael Gilmore. So he didn't send me out solo,
Mhm.
he had an actual journalist coming along with me. But yeah, I just got all these really great, and that's I would like when Neil Gaiman was signing, like the Golden Apple had everybody sign. I would just go to all the signings, and I just met everybody, and it was great. Then you'd hang out afterwards sometimes. So it was really just this awesome, awesome scene. And I kept up my fanzine writing, and I guess I kind of got it into my head that I would like to work in comics. And Disney Comics was located in LA at this time.
Okay,
And
right.
right. So they were the only show in town, because, Marvel and DC were still back in New York. And I think I interviewed for a job there, but I didn't want to move or something. And I heard that Marv Wolfman was looking for an assistant and for this Disney Adventures magazine. And I was like, I need to get this job. I really need to get I don't know. I just, again, I had it in my head that I was going to get this job. And, Marv still remembers the story, but I went in for an interview. I mean, I knew Marv. And again, I ran into him at a party, and he mentioned he was looking for an assistant and that I should send in my resume. Now, that would never happen now. You got to go through HR.
Yeah. Well, listen,
So,
the human network was everything.
right.
Yeah.
So I super, super lucked out with my timing there. But I went in for an interview. I was only a freelance position, so that's probably one of the reasons why I was able to get in without HR. And he sent me some plot. He sent me a plot for a Rescue Rangers story and said, let me know what you think of this plot. Because that was the job. You would get all these pitches, and you'd pick out the best story for the Rescue Rangers and Tailspin and DuckTales and everything. And I read it, and I was like, this story sucks. So I wrote that, and I said, this story, there's really nothing happens, and it's just very weak motivation. Gadget wouldn't do that. I didn't even know Rescue Rangers that. I must have had to watch it or something, or else I wouldn't. I wasn't that arrogant. And then Marv says I was the only person who was critical of this plot. Like all the other applicants
We're like, yeah, this is great.
This is great.
Yeah.
So that's why I got hired, and the rest is history.
Yeah. That's so, yeah, I mean, listen, it is interesting how we are, how who we are sort of navigates who we, where we go in these worlds that we sort of work our way through. So, being the person, yeah, because I mean, it's so easy to just go like, well, no, this is great. I loved it, because you think you're answering the question that somebody like, it's so funny. You answering it the way you think that they want to hear versus answering the question that they ask you. What do you think?
Right. But, there's also, the other way, which I feel the internet has fostered, which is like complete negativity and complete, like, this sucks and I don't like it. I don't like it, so it sucks.
It's so interesting you say that. So I went to our college, and in New York City, and Will Eisner was my teacher. And, but what was really fascinating to me was what I recognized by the time we were finishing was this incredible sort of cloud of negativity, because there's this thing about like art school, like, well, everything sucks, and, and I mean, like, this is why bands like, The Cure are popular in art school.
Did you go to, what art school did you go to?
I went to School of Visual Arts.
Okay, SVA. Well,
yeah.
Art School Confidential. I mean, yeah. SVA, legendary. But anyway, continue. Yeah.
So, and I remember getting to this point right after school and saying, you know what? I can't do that anymore. Like, I can't be like, everything can't suck. I just need to, say what I like and like the things I like, not even talk about the stuff that I don't like, because it's not an interest anymore. Who cares? So that was kind of an important kind of like moment. And yeah, listen, the internet of the 90s bothered me with that negativity. I would sit there and I would argue on forums because people were like, this sucks or that sucks. And I was like, and and it drove me crazy because I'm like, you're not making these things. You're not putting yourself out there.
Right. And I
Try-
just want to throw in there that cartoon, of like, I can't sleep, somebody on the internet is wrong. I mean, that goes back to like 2000. I mean, that's an old
yeah,
cartoon. That is not from social
it's not
media.
new.
It goes all the way back. Yeah.
No, you're right, and it's very much a thing, and like yeah, that's where I understood like you learn about flaming and all this stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, like this is a thing. Like I wasn't in it enough to know like the lingo, but that negativity, it's tough, man. Like we're handed these little television stations in our pockets, and we can say and do what we want, right? Isn't that the rule? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
it's tough. It's tough because our human maturity doesn't keep up with our technological advancements. So we're
Mm.
still
Well, but you know what? I mean, that lesson was learned in the 90s on Usenet. You
yeah,
know, I mean, it's like when people talk about flame wars and everything that goes on now, it's like we already knew this.
yeah,
We already had ways to
yeah,
deal with. That's where all these phrases like flame war and
yeah.
trolling and all of these, we already had developed the the
Alexa,
vocabulary, the lexicon, and had experience of it. And it was obvious that the only places that you could go were ones that were heavily moderated. And
right.
I was on, my mother was on the internet before me. I mean, she's like the tech and art leader in my
Yeah,
family.
my dad was too.
And
Yeah,
yeah, right, okay. And but she was, on CompuServe, which was, where the early comics internet, that and Genie, and oh, there was a third one that I never was on, Prodigy. And like it was moderated. And
yeah.
let me tell you, man, it was like the secret pros place on CompuServe. And if you thank God it's gone, because the flame wars there between pros were unbelievable. They make Twitter honestly look tame,
Yeah.
because they would go on for days and people would take. I mean, if you saw the names that were arguing, you'd be shocked.
I
Talk about,
remember the scuttlebutt of that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's just, like anytime I see, the people who run Twitter and Facebook saying like, oh well, all opinions should be valid. It's like, we try that, and when you try that, that's what we have now.
Yeah,
Open lies
yeah.
and disinformation, trolling, racism, sexism,
Anonymity. I mean,
transphobia.
it's
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 just the
anonymity.
worst.
Like,
Yeah, and anonymity. But it's not. It's
yeah.
not like it's not. It's not a new discovery. It's
No,
already
no,
known.
it's
It's
been
just
around.
how.
It's been around forever. Letters were
Yeah.
written in with pseudonyms to tell all these tell-all letters hundreds of years ago. This is the nature of like anonymity provides that space where someone can behave in a fashion that is outside of what they would normally do, and that's a real. It's unfortunate, but it's unfortunately human, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of good that's obviously come out of social media. I mean, I don't mean to say that, but it's like the extremes become more and more. Like it starts out here, and now the extremes are farther and farther apart. Now they're farther and farther apart, and it's just it's
Cool.
crazy.
Like, man, it's cool if you don't agree with me, and I'm cool with your opinion. That's fine in life. You like
But
just
yeah, what the one of the greatest part of working at Disney with Marv was the other people around us, was Len Wein, this guy named Lee Nordling, who was like a really great story editor, Floyd Norman, the legendary Disney animator, which is one of the smartest and most wisest people I've ever met in my life, and other people of that ilk. And then Marv's office was like this Monday morning coffee clutch where everybody would come in and talk about whatever movies they'd seen over the weekend. And like I would have my opinions, but this was a pretty detailed analysis. This was
yeah.
like real, like
What's a master?
story editing.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, it was a masterclass. It was absolutely a masterclass. So I learned so much about storytelling, and also just why Disney movies stood the test of time. Just to bring this all full circle, because I think our time
we're getting
is. I think
close.
we're gonna have to close. So now to bring it full circle, like one of the things that as Rings of Power goes along annoys me is that I can see that they didn't they didn't really hash it out. Okay. And
Yeah.
I've told this story before in, other interviews or in writings or whatever, but, Floyd was working for Pixar. He was working on Toy Story 2. And I had moved back to New York, but I was in LA. And this is again, these were the days, like I just walked straight into the Walt Disney Animation Building, and Floyd is like, "Oh yeah, here's, we're doing dinosaurs. Here's
Sure.
Tarzan," and like we literally, hey, you want to see Mike Mignola's concept art for
Right.
Atlantis? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
So literally, he just walks me through and shows me all this stuff, and I mean, what am I going to do with it? I'll tell my friends. That's it.
Right.
There was no,
Yeah. No,
wasn't enough of an, yeah,
totally. It
yeah.
was a
But
safe
anyway,
time.
yeah. But anyway, so I went to Floyd's office, and we were just hanging out. We went to lunch. We go back. We're hanging out, and he's got, it's just like the movies. He's got all the index cards on the wall, and he's like, trying to work on the scene where the toys are trying to cross the street, and I think it's, now I can't remember. It is in the movie. Like Buzz has a crisis of confidence.
Hmm.
Now, why does he have this crisis of confidence in crossing the street? And in Toy Story 2, there was this whole scene where they need to cross the street. That's very dangerous for them,
Right.
and they do get across the street. But like, it was that level of detail. Like, he had to have, like, again, Floyd Norman is a legend. He has a documentary about him. He's a legend. He's just one of the most legendary animation minds of all times. And here he is, just spending the day trying to come up with one tiny story point.
Well, and I'm sure Disney's is the history of Disney is replete with that. But that, to me, the way the story is built in the Pixar model is a revolution. They really it is no longer the responsibility of one brilliant person to come up with a story, and here we go, this is the brilliant person's story. This is a conglomeration of the best minds that they can get together and tell the story to, and see, and they go, I love this. What if we just had him grab a whatever, and now he has this thing, and then he could use that later, and people go like, this opens up a whole new thing. And like, it's this ability to Socratically discuss a story and see all these elements. It's because it's not the writer's room. It's not sitting in a writer's room where it's how clever can I be and make everyone laugh. And then everyone runs off and writes their own script. This is everybody coming together to throw ideas out to the people or person writing the script, who says, okay, now I can take all this beautiful, concept that has been stacked up, and now what do I do with it? And now you can kind of play it in and put the thing. And that's why Pixar movies are really modern fairy tales.
Yeah, I mean, there was,
By and
listen,
large.
I mean, right, but they are, absolutely. But I mean, I will say, like, having conversations with some of the people behind, Aladdin. I was working at Disney when Aladdin came out, with Aladdin, and that period, which went from the highest highs of Beauty, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and then ended up in Atlantis. It just petered out. But it was still good, but it did go down into this dark ages as Pixar ascended, right? But I mean, I got to talk to some of the Pixar people too, and I will say, I think that level of detail, of storytelling detail, character detail, was very much part of the whole Disney process during this period, and it's why these movies really last and last and last and last, and is because and you see, I mean, I don't want to put down the rise of fan fiction, and archive of our own and all that. Like, now fans think about these things a lot too, and they analyze the characters, and I think it's because they were created with so much depth
and care,
that they have, that they're just really rich topsoil for these stories to grow.
They feel real. And I think, tying it back to, Tolkien, or, Harry Potter, we read these stories, and these characters are so human, whether they're humans or not. And
Mhm.
we all identify with these traits and these characteristics that we want these characters to have more. We want to do more with them. So it's an understandable thing. And I mean, it's, and it's why people such as myself go, oh, I want to get into comic books because I love Peter Parker and I love Spider-Man and I want to do something with that. Or
Right.
you go, I want to write about this medium that is so important to me, that is so it is really an engaging, embracing medium, um, by and large. And there's these, you can't have a better preacher for it than Neil Gaiman. I mean, this guy is the
Mhm.
best evangelist for comics in the history of comics. And yeah, listen, it's a great thing. Yeah, I don't know. Shoot, I can talk about this stuff all the time. I do talk about it all the time. So do you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
What we
So
do. It's what
uh,
we do.
yeah. So what like I actually read 2 or 3 articles before we actually started talking today. So so your jam is on comicsbeat.com, right?
Mhm.
That's where everybody can
Yeah.
catch what you're doing all the time. That and
Yeah,
on
this is a yes, yeah, so website, yeah, well, I sound off on Twitter, but yes, comicsbeat.com's been running for about 18, 17, 18 years now. And it is, I have other contributors on there, but I call it the website of comics culture. I've always been just fascinated by what it is about these that, why do these stories work so well? Who are the people behind them? And,
Mhm,
what are the business forces that make it work? And I mostly write a lot of business stories, which I don't know how that happened. Like now I basically do business analysis of the comics industry. Because I guess just doing reviews and stuff became a little too fraught for me, just,
mhm,
given I always say don't write something you wouldn't say to a person's face. And
right.
that covers
Anonymity,
it all.
right.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, I write a lot of business, but we cover the business side of things. I have a really great staff of amazing, amazing writers, and they're becoming kind of like very. I'm glad that some of them are getting respected and getting known and getting their voices out there. And some of them like are moving on to work in the industry, which excites the hell out of me when they do that. So yeah, just yeah, I always say I was just to the manor born. I was never going to escape comics, and just it's just the way it worked out. It's okay. That's where I went. It's been pretty good so far.
yeah. No, I mean, listen, I don't really work in comics that much, and but it is my first love, and I really do, I have great care for it, and I enjoy the hell out of really everybody in it on every level. There are just so many fun and impassioned people, in this industry. So there's just and listen, nothing's better than going to convention with the people who love the same thing you do.
Yeah, because nobody stays in it for the money.
No,
They all stay in it because they love
no,
it, and
we
that
leave because
makes
of the money.
yeah, and that's why you have people who are just really passionate and love what they do, and
Totally.
it's good to be around that. It's a
Yeah.
good influence.
Well, Heidi, I really appreciate you taking the time. I mean, this has been fun. I mean, this is, I'll listen. I'd be happy to sit and talk about Tolkien the whole time. Do
I
some,
know we could. I think I got to start a Tolkien podcast. To be honest, I think we got to. Me and my entertainment editor Therese is also a big Tolkien nerd, so we've been talking about doing it for a year.
yeah, yeah.
And I guess the time is now. We only have 5 more weeks, so we better hop on it.
Time is nigh, as they would say, right? Uh,
Yes, yes.
yeah, no, listen, it's one of my favorite subjects, near and dear to my heart. And but I'm glad that we actually got to jive about
Yeah,
it.
me too. This is great. This is the
Yeah,
first person I've really talked to a lot about it. So
yeah, no,
yeah,
I'm
just
excited,
getting
and
started.
I'll be very curious watching episode 3 because it's listen, it's the landing. We have to wait for the landing. Everything comes down to the landing. How do you finish this whole thing? And that's
Yeah.
where we.
Well, it's really beautiful. I'll say this, it's really
Oh
beautiful,
yeah,
but lower your
I think
expectations as far as
I
the
think
story goes.
your line was you see every single dollar spent on the screen in this show, and you're
Mhm.
right.
Yeah,
You really do.
yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
Well,
I
I have another delivery coming, so I
Okay.
gotta
No, no,
I
no.
gotta bet.
We will wrap this up. So thanks a lot, and stay in touch, and we'll see everyone
Yeah,
next week. All right. Thanks a
thank
lot.
you.